Hello my beautiful watchers. As of the making of this video, Wicked Part 1 starring Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande has recently defied gravity and low expectations regarding musical theatre to film adaptations by proving to be a popular and genuinely engaging interpretation of the story. Also, I've heard, I've not personally seen it yet, or the musical it's based on because, well, I'm a masochist and I decided to start my exploration of Wicked right at the beginning. The very beginning. You see, as adaptations go, Wicked can boast an atypically long lineage as it's a big screen version of a stage musical that itself was based on a book which in turn was inspired by another book. So yeah, you're getting a bunch of videos out of me on this subject so we can see just how much the story changed over this 124-year-long multi-medium game of telephone. However, before getting started on any of the adaptations, I'm doing a book review. I would very much like to share some thoughts with you about Wicked, because I have some thoughts about Wicked. Wicked, the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West, usually referred to just as Wicked to save time, is a novel by American author Gregory Maguire, published in 1995. Maguire's personal life doesn't appear to have been the subject of as much scrutiny as other authors, and the majority of the interviews I could dig up about him seem to be mostly focused on his thoughts on the musical or recent films, so my information on him is a little limited. In fact, the only things I know is he's apparently managed to juggle being in an openly gay marriage and being a devout Catholic, which seems, a little contradictory. Anyways, as the name implies, it's a story set in the land of Oz, originally created by L. Frank Baum in his turn of the 20th century series of children's novels, the Oz books, which are now in the public domain, so fair game for any author who wishes to use the world for his own ends. It chronicles the supposedly very misunderstood and misrepresented life of a minor antagonist from the pilot book, retelling her story to be significantly more sympathetic while demonizing multiple supposedly good or at least neutral characters. The story is split into 5-ish parts covering the 38-year life of the Wicked Witch of the West, whose real name is Elphaba, from her birth to her death at the hands of Dorothy, the original book's protagonist. Elphaba is joined by at least one or two other POV characters throughout the 5 different parts, as friends and relations come in and out of her life, but none of them stick around for the entire book. Indeed, a running theme throughout the story is everyone except Elphaba eventually choosing to bury their heads in the sand regarding the injustices of the world that she dedicates her life to fighting. The reasons vary from being tempted by the allure of a more comfortable life for them personally, to fear of the consequences of defiance, or just having different priorities, but the result is Elphaba is the only person consistently willing to go the distance for what she knows is right, and this eventually leads to her having a miserable, lonely life, an ignoble death, and an infamous legacy. Now, unfortunately, if I am making this book sound interesting or enjoyable, I have unintentionally misled you. I did not like this book. My complaints are a mix of objective and subjective, and I hope I'll make which is which obvious, but yeah, I'm not recommending it. If you added to cart in the last few minutes, I would advise you to at least hold off until the end of the video. A synopsis may be in order because, quite frankly, some issues make themselves apparent just by describing the plot, but if you have already read it, you can skip ahead to this timecode. Starting with a quick reminder of the world that this book is set in, Oz is an isolated landmass surrounded by a seemingly impassable desert that's divided into 4 major nations that happen to be fairly neatly divided into the cardinal directions. The people living in the individual parts of the country all have different names, but despite the film's depiction of the Munchkins and the Winkies, there's nothing in the original text that suggests that they were anything other than humans with a mild preference for a certain color-coded aesthetic. Talking animals also exist and are, at least at the start of the story, treated as basically human. There's 2 major scandals on the day of Elphaba's birth. Firstly, she is born with green skin and sharp teeth. This is eventually deduced by her mother to be the result of uncertain parentage, as she has vague recollections of a passing traveller having drugged her with a green potion and suspecting he might have had his way with her during the resulting memory loss. So yeah, not only does the book get started with sexual assault, the Wicked Witch of the West's iconic green skin is revealed to be the result of her being a child of rape. I feel like I have to repeat this because it kind of sets the tone for the entire book. The main character's most distinctive and plot-relevant physical feature is a side effect of the date rape drug that someone used to molest her mother. It's a manifestation of and constant reminder that her life began with sexual assault. I'm really not sure what else to say here except what the fuck, Gregory? The other major event of that day is Elphaba's mother's husband, who works as a preacher for a religion that worships an unnamed god, loses a fight with a travelling magic clock that somehow shows people puppet shows of local people's private lives, getting himself orchestrated from the village. As a result, Elphaba is raised in isolation by a father who spends most of his time away from home trying to reconnect with his faith, and a mother who low-key hates and resents her for what she looks like and blames her for her loss of social life. They're eventually joined by a travelling quadling glassblower named Turtleheart, who starts what appears for most of the book to be an affair with Elphaba's mother, but is later revealed to have been a consensual polyamorous relationship between him and both her parents. The throuple end up having 2 more children, Nessa Rose, who, possibly due to her parents taking a bunch of noxious medicines in an attempt to avoid more green skin, is born with healthy skin, but no arms. And a young boy named Shell in Turtleheart's honour, who doesn't feature that much in this story, but I'm given to understand is a major antagonist in the sequels. You retroactively find out in the next section that Turtleheart was eventually murdered by an angry mob who were desperate enough to end a countrywide drought to attempt human sacrifice, and Elphaba's mother died in childbirth. Part 2 of the book jumps ahead a few years to Elphaba's first term at a prestigious boarding school run by a conniving and politically ambitious headmistress, Madame Morrible. It's here that the general political situation in the Land of Oz is revealed in greater detail through multiple discussions and debates between the different characters. It turns out the formerly independent nations are largely under the control of the wizard in the Emerald City now, and he's been busy modernizing and urbanizing the formerly quaint little towns of the world, building yellow brick roads between them and introducing a rather harsh new tax system. Despite having developed a pretty antisocial demeanor from her shitty upbringing, Elphaba forms a surprisingly strong friendship with her assigned roommate Galinda and a Munchkinlander called Bock. Nessa Rose also joins the school a year or 2 later and is revealed to be extremely religiously devout and their father's favourite, receiving gifts in the mail like some sick-ass shoes while Elphaba is completely ignored. Galinda goes through a whole arc in this section, starting out as a snobby elitist but slowly coming to see the error of her ways after a proclamation from the wizard reduces the rights of all talking animals of the world as part of a scapegoat propaganda campaign to blame them for the ongoing drought and famine. This affects, amongst others, one of their teachers, a goat by the name of Dr. Dillamond. He becomes a literal scapegoat. It's not subtle. Elphaba, Galinda and Bock form a secret society to help Dr. Dillamond continue his research that aims to scientifically prove that sapient animals share a common genetic code with humans and therefore deserve equal treatment. This comes to a tragic end when Dr. Dillamond is murdered, almost certainly at the behest of Madame Morrible, who then attempts to recruit Elphaba, Galinda and Nessa Rose into becoming her political agents to be installed in positions of power around the world. Elphaba decides that this Orwellian shit has gone far enough and decides to talk to the big man himself, dragging Galinda, who's changed her name to Glinda in honour of Dr. Dillamond, who once mispronounced it that way, to the Emerald City and before the wizard. Elphaba is unimpressed with the wizard's attempt to convince her that he's a giant skeleton puppet, but doesn't get anywhere regarding getting Dr. Dillamond's murder investigated. In fact, it becomes quite obvious that he is the one pulling Madame Morrible's strings. Part 2 ends with Elphaba sending Glinda back to the school alone and going off-grid to fight the wizard's schemes outside the law. Part 3 is another good couple of years down the line and is mostly told from the perspective of Fiyero, a character who'd been introduced partway through Part 2 as a latecomer to the school. He's a Winky and the prince of a relatively minor tribe. He's now in an arranged marriage with kids, but spends most of his time in the Emerald City looking for ways to improve his people's way of life. He bumps into Elphaba by pure coincidence, and even though she tries to escape him at first, he eventually gets her to talk to him and discovers she's working as one cell of an underground resistance movement, planning terrorist attack to resist the wizard's persecution of sapient animals. Clearly desperately lonely and in need of human connection, Elphaba becomes involved with Fiyero, but never trusts him enough to share any information on her plans. After observing a few secret arrests and public executions of innocent animal families, Fiyero starts feeling the cause himself, but resists trying to get involved for fear it would endanger his relationship with Elphaba. He eventually witnesses Elphaba make a failed attempt to assassinate Madame Morrible and goes back to her apartment to look for her, Elphaba, where he's jumped by a band of the Wizard's Gestapo known as the Gale Force, who presumably were looking for Elphaba but settle for beating him to death. After finding his body, Elphaba goes into a fugue state and stumbles into a nunnery where she spends the next 6 years recovering. Part 4 picks up when she's eventually stable enough to leave and takes with her a young boy called Leah, or possibly Liar, who she's pretty sure is her and Fiero's son, but she isn't 100% because she can't fully remember the first year after Fiero's death. Driven by a deep psychological need to gain some form of forgiveness, they travel to Fiero's castle in the Vinkus or Winky country. She tries to discuss the matter with his widow Samira, but she doesn't want any details, so Elphaba just kind of sticks around, hoping she can one day do something to repay the debt she feels she has. While she's there, she discovers a powerful grimoire. I think it's not spelt the way I would have thought. This book is not friendly to dyslexics, okay? But it's a magic book filled with text that she can only half read. She doesn't really do much with it, but she senses that it's a very plot-relevant MacGuffin, so she hides it somewhere safe. Samira's children, especially her eldest son Manik, bully Liar constantly and even nearly get him killed by trapping him in a well and leaving him there for days. Manik is tragically and suspiciously killed a short time later as an icicle falls from a cave roof and impales him like a frickin' javelin. Soldiers from the Emerald City arrive, supposedly just doing surveys and other innocent soldier stuff, and are made welcome despite Elphaba's advice not to invite the armed forces of a genocidal despot inside the house. In a surprise twist, Elphaba's childhood nanny turns up and informs her that her sister Nessa Rose has helped lead a bloodless revolt in Munchkinland and seceded the nation from the Wizard's Empire. Shortly later, her father writes to her and asks her to come home and take over from her little sis because, though she was good at inciting a revolution, her intense religious fervour and use of sorcery is making her a very unpopular leader. They've even dubbed her the Wicked Witch of the East. Elphaba uses her newly invented flying broomstick to nip over to Munchkinland and see for herself. Witnessing her sister agree to curse the axe of the guy who would eventually become the Tin Woodsman, the first direct tie-in to the original novel. While Nessa Rose does indeed seem to be becoming less and less popular, Elphaba decides not to usurp her and flies back to the west, only to find that tragically, if not surprisingly, in her absence the Emerald City soldiers had stormed the castle and kidnapped Fiero's family. Part 5, again a few years later, is pretty much the events of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, starting with Dorothy's farmhouse crushing Nessa Rose to death. Interestingly, Elphaba exclusively self-identifies as the witch in her internal monologue in this section, so I guess I will too. The witch flies back to Munchkinland to grieve her sister's death and is pissed that Glinda, now a minor sorceress and semi-public figure who just happened to be passing by, had given her sister's shoes to Dorothy. This really upset her, partly because they represented the love her father never gave her, and partly because they have a powerful enchantment on them, and they've sort of become a symbol for Munchkinland independence, so she's worried about what would happen if the wizard got his hands on them. Said wizard makes a surprise visit and summons the witch to a secret meeting, this time appearing in his true old man form. He demands that she turn over the grimoire as it's, and bear with me on this one, a powerful magical item from his alternate universe that he crossed over into this one to find, and the reason that he started this whole dictatorship thing. Though he is enjoying ruling so much he plans to stick with it even once he gets his book. The witch tries to negotiate for Samira and her children's release, but it turns out the wizard killed all but one of them already, and the only remaining daughter is basically catatonic from all the abuse she suffered. He also lets her know that it was Madame Morrible who put the witch on his radar back in the day, which eventually led to Fiero's death. The witch starts to have an extended mental breakdown at this point that goes on until the end of the book, and quite honestly, reading the rest of this book almost gave me a mental breakdown, so please keep that in mind while I try to fumble my way through the rest of this synopsis. She runs into Bach, who's just finished with his one appearance in the original book. He's just kind of accepted the world is the way it is at this point, which frustrates the witch so much she decides, after some thought, that the only thing that will make her feel better is murdering Madame Morrible. However, by pure happenstance, the old woman dies of old age minutes before she gets to her, so the witch can only bash the corpse's head in to vent some feelings. She then meets another old school friend who seems entirely unbothered by her new self-proclaimed murderous status and throws a fancy dinner party for her where she gets a little drunk. She stumbles out into the night and runs into the magic clock that got her father beaten up way back in the day, and it turns out it's run by another interdimensional traveller who's also trying to track down the Gregory Maguire, but to, like, protect it from evil, I guess? He puts on a private show for her, and the clock shows her her own personal history, which, amongst other things, proves to her that the wizard is the guy who drugged and assaulted her mother, making him her biological father and her half-earthling. She flies off on her broom and drunkenly stalks Dorothy from the air for a bit, because she's now been sent on her assassination mission by the wizard to, kill the witch. The relevant part of L. Frank Baum's book then plays out, in which the witch sends out wave after wave of ineffective animals to attack the approaching party, until she eventually resorts to using the flying monkeys, which, in this version of the story, she actually created by surgically attaching wings to monkeys. I believe with the intention of helping them survive in this new anti-animal world better. Hungover and super sleep deprived, she acts kind of crazy around Dorothy and loses her shit a bit when the lass reveals that she did not come to the West to kill her, but to seek forgiveness for accidentally killing her sister. Unfortunately, this triggers the witch a bit because she never got the forgiveness she craved, and she accidentally sets her clothing on fire while threatening Dorothy, and the girl tries to save her with a bucket of water, with famously melty results. In a small silver lining, in the aftermath of the witch's death, Dorothy inadvertently causes the deposement of the wizard, but his anti-witch propaganda campaign outlived his rules, so the only thing the Wicked Witch of the West is remembered for is a reputation for malice. As you cannot have failed to notice, Maguire's version of this world is by magnitudes more adult-themed and darker than the original, in a way that I think would have been quite upsetting for the late Mr. Baum, considering how dedicated he was to the entertainment of children and the preservation of their innocence. Maguire wrote 3 sequels to Wicked, told from the perspective of her son, the Cowardly Lion, and then her granddaughter, who is now getting her own spin-off series of books as well. So, I guess my first issue is just, why? Why does this exist like this, and specifically, why is it Oz fanfiction? Maguire has claimed that his primary motivation was to write a story about the nature of evil, and for sure this book has a lot to say about patriarchy and misogyny, racism and the demonization of the other, and the dangers of rampant propaganda and or blind faith. These are obviously important issues, and their exploration in literature can only be a benefit to society. However, I just cannot wrap my head around what in the everlasting wild fuck nuggets any of that has to do with L. Frank Baum's intellectual property. Of all the famous fictional worlds he could have chosen from, the Land of Oz seems the least suited to these themes because, certainly in the wonderful Wizard of Oz on which it's primarily based, the entire country has no obvious religion and is ruled exclusively by women. I don't think Baum gets enough credit for that. In the year of our Lord 1900, he wrote about a female protagonist adventuring in 4 nations run by sorceresses, and the lack of the usual male-dominated power structure is never lamented. Half of these women being evil is admittedly a bit of a problem, but their lack of dicks is not. And yes, I know Oz himself temporarily upset this status quo, but he was the de facto ruler of a city-state at best. His influence was all bluff, and in the second book in the series, Baum restored a girl to the throne of the Emerald City. A girl who was a boy for quite a while, and has a whole thing with gender identity, but that's like, I can't get into that right now, it's a whole different thing. But yeah, in order for the world to facilitate the systemic injustices that Elphaba could rail against, Maguire had to twist every part of it so much it's effectively unrecognizable. And he had to perform mental gymnastics in the plot to make sure women weren't in power, like Glinda wasn't actually the Good Witch of the North, she was just a semi-influential socialite who happened to be in town when Dorothy arrived, and the Witch of the East was actually just a religious figurehead of a revolutionary provisional government, and the Wicked Witch of the West didn't actually enslave and rule over the West, she was just there. She was the wicked, extended house guest of the West. And there's no Witch of the South because Maguire is not being honest with us about what his book is actually based on, but I'm going to address that in another video. So, it's kind of inescapable to conclude that he chose Oz as his setting because he valued brand recognition over suitability, and because to a certain extent I think he wanted to tap into that shock jock, look, I took something childish and innocent and added sex and death to it, edgelord marketing bullcrap that I have such limited patience for. And you know what? It gets so much worse, because, I mean, buckle up. There's a lot of uncomfortable, borderline sexual stuff going on with children in this book. It's never quite explicit enough for me to be surprised that this book got published, but it's weird. It's stuff like Elphaba's sexually frustrated, isolated mother showing her boobs to her infant child because she's got no one else to flash them to, or a 4-year-old playing with her mother's nipples while describing another child's penis to her, or a pre-teen boy getting his first erection from seeing people attempt to revive the bloated, naked body of a drowned child. I'm not making a personal accusation against Maguire or anything, I'm just saying, what the fuck, Gregory? Ironically, despite the injustices that come of socially ingrained sexism being a key theme in the overall story, I did not love the way that Maguire wrote about women in this book, or how he approached very serious subjects like sexual assault. I mean, just starting your book with a sexual assault shows a somewhat cavalier attitude towards alienating readers. There's also a distinct lack of sympathy for survivors throughout the book, both in the way the narrative presents it and the way the fictional characters act within it. Honestly, the way that the book treats Elphaba's mother is straight up fucked in my opinion. Her own childhood nanny, who pressed her to look for the truth about Elphaba's parentage, offers zero comfort to her, seemingly because she had a history of promiscuity. There's also just this general vibe of she brought it on herself because she was stupid enough to drink the magic potion. It suggested this definitely wasn't the only time she's been assaulted too, because she did drugs around strangers, so what did she expect to happen? This is not the only traumatizing non-consensual event of the book either, and Lord have mercy on all of our souls, the other one is not only disturbing, it's also just like crazy weird. For context, this takes place on the same day as a funeral for a major character who had probably been assassinated for witnessing Dr. D's murder, and the same day that Madame Morrible had tried to recruit the 3 girls into being political agents. Elphaba and Glinda are off in the Emerald City seeing the wizard, so they're not involved, but the other POV character, Bok, and the other male members of the friend group decide to go to an exclusive sex club where one of them is forced to have sex with a tiger. One of the provisos of getting in is you have to agree to participate in a sex show if you're randomly selective, and you can't leave once you're inside. A lad called Tibbet is chosen, and I mean, I'm not gonna put the details up here on YouTube, but I assure you it is graphic. Tibbet is clearly too drunk to coherently object to this in the moment, but it's mentioned in passing a few time jumps later that he is understandably permanently psychologically damaged by what happened. These are teenage boys. Teenagers. What the fuck, Gregory? This contributes less than nothing to the plot, by the way. It doesn't even involve the main character. Elphaba doesn't even learn about it until the end of the book, where the revelation continues to contribute nothing to the plot. It's impossible to overstate how unnecessary this was. And you know what, even when it's consensual and of age, the way that Bro depicts sex and sexuality in this book is still weirdly negative. Single people apparently never bang in this world. The only time consensual sex occurs is when a married person is cheating on their spouse, be it Elphaba's mother or Fiyero with Elphaba. Elphaba appears to use sex exclusively to temporarily stave off her deep sense of loneliness and to manipulate her partners, and while this makes sense in the context of the story because she has a lot of issues due to her childhood trauma and the other big life events, it still contributes to the overall feeling of just mild disgust with sex, or at least straight sex. I have to admit, finding out that Maguire is gay made me wonder if this perhaps recontextualized a few things, but I don't know. Getting into more subjective complaints, it started to bother me that almost everything Elphaba does of note happens off-page so that the bulk of the book can exclusively focus on her interpersonal relationships. I realise it was never intended to be an action-adventure book, but would it have really killed Maguire to give us one scene of her doing the animal rights subterfuge that was supposed to be such an important part of her character? Was the scene where Fiyero oils her boobs up for her really so important he couldn't spare a few pages to to show off Elphaba's capabilities in things besides social interaction. And because Maguire seems to like skipping over all the action, the time jumps always caught me off guard. Like every time it looked like things were about to gear up for a big climax to a section, suddenly it's 7 years later. So, as I mentioned, everyone but Elphaba eventually falling off the true path is a major theme of the story. Elphaba doesn't invite Glinda to join her when she jumps ship to join the rebellion, but neither does it even occur to Glinda to do so, and apparently without Elphaba's influence, she eventually reverts back to her original airheaded vanity and social climbing fixation. Likewise, despite having been close to Dr. Dillamond, Boq just kind of drifts away from the conspiracy and becomes rich and comfortable. Fiyero clearly cares about the cause, but avoids attempting to get involved because he values his relationship with Elphaba more, so chooses not to rock the boat. I really wanted to like the implied message about the importance of having the strength of character to pursue what you know is right over choosing to learn to live with a certain amount of tyranny for personal comfort, but it's kind of undercut because I couldn't help but notice that despite Elphaba's iron will, she doesn't actually achieve anything by the end. I don't think she made things significantly worse despite her self-loathing, but she didn't make the world a better place. And it seems like her antisocial behaviour is mainly to blame, by seeking the love of the people, at least at first. Nessa Rose does more in the fight against the wizard's world domination in one chapter than Elphaba does in the entire book. So as a result, the message is in danger of becoming caring is good, but don't be an SJW about it, which is not a helpful moral to the story. And my fear that Maguire's ultimate message was anti-being annoying while doing the right thing was worsened in part 4, when all the talking animals of Oz have been so worn down and abused they've basically accepted their status as a slave class. So much so that when Elphaba releases a small group of them from a cage, they don't actually try to escape and seem pretty exasperated that she insists that they leave. I apologise for the following digression, but in the past, I would have assumed this scene's only purpose was to emphasize how bad things have gotten. But then I remembered Spew. You guys know what I'm referring to, right? Harry Potter? Yeah, I know I said I'd never talk about that on this channel again, but trust me, this is relevant. In Book 4, Hermione makes it her quest to liberate the House Elves, but they seem pretty keen on staying slaves and no one else takes her quest seriously. Now, when I first read these books as a teen, I didn't realise just how fucked up this was because, well, it just never occurred to me that anyone, especially not J.K. Rowling, could possibly see Hermione as being in the wrong. I thought it was just a given that slavery would always be a bad thing, and being annoying while pointing that out was not a crime of equal measure. I thought the elves and the wizards' comfort with the situation was a commentary on the wizarding world having rot at its fundamental core that paved the way for people like Voldemort to exist. But then, several years after the last of the books came out, JK wrote that fucking think piece on Pottermore that basically both sides the issue and suggested that if everyone involved is happy with the situation, then maybe Hermione should learn to mind her own business a little more, and my mind just kind of cracked. So, and there is a point to this, because my opinion of Maguire has been taking such a battering throughout this book, I can't be sure that insisting on freeing the animals who no longer wanted to be freed wasn't supposed to reflect negatively on Elphaba and highlight how far she's fallen from grace as the book approaches the end. I hope that that is not the case and I'm just dealing with some J.K. Rowling related PTSD, but I don't know. Not super shockingly, I was also kind of horrified by the way that Maguire handles subjects like suicide. You find out in part 3 that Boq eventually got married to a woman several struts above him on the nobility ladder, and because of the resulting drop in standard of living for her, his wife routinely attempted to kill herself, like, at least once a year. And, well, he told her what he knew. Boq had married Miss Miller of all surprising turns. She had been dragged out to Ness Harding's and she hated it. She kept trying suicide. His letters sent at Lolimus every year are hysterical. They annotate her failed attempts at killing herself like a sort of annual family report. What the fuck, Gregory? Buck, a guy who debated ethics in college, who risked everything to facilitate Dr. Dillamon's research by smuggling banned books out of the school to him and Elphaba, has, in just a few short years without Elphaba's influence, become such a piece of shit, he's sending out Christmas letters making jokes about his wife's repeated suicide attempts, and everyone finds them really funny. Elphaba doesn't even react to this information. She just starts wondering out loud if her mother's dip in social standing affected her in the same way. At best, you could maybe excuse this as Maguire intentionally making all of these characters look bad, but this is a conversation between Fiyero and Elphaba. Liking them enough to not want them to die is kind of essential to the chapter and the book as a whole. Making us hate them is utterly counterproductive. Okay, well, I'm getting wildly depressed, and a lot of my other complaints are adaptation related, so I'm just going to round this video off with some smaller stuff, then we can move on with our lives. The Wizard's Gestapo are referred to as the Gale Force, which I assumed for most of the book was a reasonably subtle commentary on how the original Dorothy became an instrument of the Wizard's enemy's destruction, but then when Dorothy actually enters the story, it becomes an actual plot point that the name is just a coincidence. A big deal is made of Madame Morrible dying just before Elphaba gets to her, so she's technically not a murderer, but apparently she subconsciously kills a cook who was being an asshole and impales a frickin' child with an icicle, so I wouldn't say her hands are completely blood-free. Okay, here's something frickin' random. The wicked version of the Land of Oz is experiencing a rise in a new religion called TikTokism, which I was going to make a joke sounds like a Gen Z lifestyle choice, but then I looked up how Maguire defined it and realized that yeah, that is exactly what it is. By pure coincidence, he named his young phone-obsessed religion the same thing as what would eventually become the unofficial app of the generation 20 years later. How weird is that? So, final thoughts, just going off the quality of the writing, I really don't think this book would have been successful without the Wizard of Oz fanfic connection propping it up. It's a book that's main appeal will always be the premise. I really do appreciate these subjects that Maguire was attempting to explore, but for me they just got kind of buried underneath the mixed messages, weird fetishes, unlikable cast, the lack of subtlety, and what to me seems like inexplicable priorities. But I'm glad I got a chance to get this stuff off my chest before starting the adaptation reviews, so I appreciate you bearing with me, my beautiful watchers. And I appreciate this video's sponsor, Nebula. Nebula is a creator-founded prestige streaming service I'm very proud to be a part of that allows its members to take their work to the next level. They enabled my friend Jesse to make a whole-ass film starring Star Trek's John Delancey, which is extremely cool and worth the price of admission alone. They also host a ton of original content you can't see anywhere else, along with early access to videos and extended cuts of videos posted by creators like Lindsay Ellis, Maggie Mayfish, Jetlag, Legal Eagle, Sarah Zed, Philosophy Tube, and Riff Tracks. I myself post exclusive content on Nebula, like my initial thoughts on new films, books, or in this case, a musical, as you can see my reaction to seeing Wicked in the Plantageous Theatre on there right now, and the Lost in adaptation about it will be viewable there before it comes out on YouTube. As Nebula is a subscription service, there's no ad breaks or sponsorships interrupting your viewing experience, and I really want to emphasize again just how much cool exclusive content is on there that you cannot watch anywhere else. With my Nebula link, nebula.tv/Dominic Noble, available in convenient clickable form in the video description, you can get 40% off an annual subscription, so you could be watching hours of extra content from all your favorite creators right now for just $36 for the entire year, which comes to $3 a month. So check it out if you want to keep the Wicked train rolling or would simply like a way to support my channel that comes with a ton of extra stuff to enjoy.